I'll talk about basic transparency. I do have some tips for you, although creating a transparent material is very straightforward. First off, make sure you use the background toggle when you're designing a transparent material. That's the only way that you'll be able to perceive the transparency in the editor. You'll start to see this colorful pattern through the object. Opacity is the component that governs transparency. Think of it as the inverse. Opacity varies from 100% down to 0. It's not possible to have a negative opacity, nor is it possible to have the opacity exceed 100%. As you decrease the opacity, you're increasing the transparency, and you'll start to see through the object. Note that we can see this pattern through the sample sphere. If you turn opacity down to 0, you might still see the object, and that's because we're seeing the specular component, or the shiny areas, even though opacity is set to 0. This brings up an important point, and that is opacity only affects the diffuse and ambient components of the material. If you want to hide the object entirely, you can either set the specular color to black or turn the specular level down to 0. You would never set opacity at 0 in a real-world material. Glass, for example, is visible. Some of the light is reflected off the glass, and some of the light is transmitted through. To simulate the light that's transmitted through the glass, you need to have a low value for opacity, say 15% or so. Another transparency feature is in the viewport. Here I have the viewport set to smoothen highlights. Note that there's a transparency item here in this menu. If I set it to none, then the teapot appears opaque even though its material is mostly transparent. When I make a rendering, it will appear transparent. These controls only affect the viewport, and the quality that you see really depends on your graphics card.